SMiLE is the name of the new Beach Boys album, which will be released in January 1967. And with a happy album cover, the really happy sounds inside, and a happy in-store display piece, you can't miss. We're sure to sell 1 million units in January.
Throughout the history of music, there has been many works that remained unfinished by composers, such as Mozart's Requiem, Schubert's Symphony No. 8, unfinished, and in 1967, perhaps the most unfinished piece of music of the 20th century is the Beach Boys' SMiLE. Now, you could say SMiLE was finished when Brian Wilson released Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE in 2004, but I think it's safe to say that the SMiLE we would have got in 1967 would not have been the SMiLE we got in 2004. What we are left with is some of the most beautiful and unique music ever released by the Beach Boys, so let's dive into this unfinished masterpiece. There's a lot of information about SMiLE, and it can be quite difficult to decipher what's real and what's not because there's a lot of mythos within SMiLE. And Brian has said things that has contradicted himself, whether he said them on purpose or not, we don't know. Like on the biography channel, Brian Wilson documentary.
It'll never come out. It's just the tapes have been destroyed.
But I think that's just Brian's way of he didn't want to talk about it, That's basically it, what I think. And I've done a lot of research, and even all the books I've read and things I've watched, there's even contradictions between them. So there's contradictions between different books and different documentaries and different things people have said online. So that's just kind of the nature of SMiLE in a lot of ways. It has that mythos of it, of you're trying to figure it out, even the history of it, even though there's certain things, obviously, that are true, that we know are true. But I think when you get down into the kind of weeds of it, it can start to get into more opinions rather than facts. So, but that's just the nature of SMiLE. I think it makes it even more interesting. I'm not going to go into music theory much in the video because that would take me forever. I would be into so much songs. But there's a guy named Tim Smolens who does these really great videos on YouTube where he breaks down tracks. Mostly he does a lot of Beach Boys stuff. And he talks about the theory within the tracks. And you should really check them out because he does a great job on them. And I'll put a link to his channel below. Also, there's some books and documentaries that I got information from. So they'll be flashing over your screen now that I think you should check them out. And at the end, like I do with all these videos, is I recreate a section of one of the songs. People always say, why don't you do the full song? It's well, it's YouTube, all that, copyright stuff. It just gets messy. So doing a little piece is kind of cool. Short and sweet, In October 1966, the Beach Boys had just released their biggest single to date, Good Vibrations. Not only was it a commercial success, but it showcased Brian Wilson's ever-expanding production and compositional talents. Like Brian had done previously on Pet Sounds, by enlisting a collaborator outside the Beach Boys ecosystem in Tony Asher, his SMiLE collaborator would be Dyke Parks. Dyke Parks was no stranger to the limelight. He was a child actor starring alongside Grace Kelly in The Swan. He was and still is a fantastic composer and arranger. He would go on to release the excellent album Song Cycle in 1967, but that's a video for another time, one which I shall get down to at some point, I'm sure. Before working with Brian, Dyke worked with many artists including Tim Buckley, Judy Collins and The Byrds. He was asked to become a member of The Byrds, but he declined the offer.
I believe I could have been a bird. I tell myself that when I'm alone. I tell myself that David actually asked me to be in The Byrds. I could have been in all the blinking lights, but I didn't think that was cool, the blinking lights, the screaming girls, the page boy haircuts. I really wanted to be off camera as much as I do now.
Dyke and Brian first met when David Crosby invited Dyke to one of the Sloop John B sessions. Dyke said, I don't even think he had the voices on it yet, but I heard that long rotational breathing, that long flute at the beginning. I knew that this man was a great musician. Several months after their first meeting, Brian and Dyke met once again at Terry Melcher's place. It was out of this meeting that would grow the foundation for their collaboration on SMiLE. Dyke attended some Good Vibration sessions. As Dyke Parks said, it was his idea to add the cello on Good Vibrations.
And I think the reason that I got the job with Brian Wilson was that I had been playing as a musician in Brian's works in the studio. And there came a time to arrange Good Vibrations, to get it done so that I could get more involved, because I wasn't really involved with Good Vibrations. I had been on the floor in the middle of Good Vibrations on a pedal, holding the pedals down with my hands, because it was easier to manipulate the foot pedals with my hands than with my stocking feet. In the middle of Good Vibrations, you'll hear a very low organ sustain pedal tone. That's me on the floor. Then I suggested the cello to Brian, because I wanted to see if I could get involved with a little more fancy music. We're going to get fancy here. We're going to get some strings in here and that aren't in the group that he's working with. And I was less mindful of the Beach Boys, so was interested in Brian Wilson's development and my own. So why don't we try a cello? So he says, great. I get to the studio and there's a cellist and there's a music stand, and his name was Jesse Ehrlich. And he was sitting there with no music on the music stand and rather perplexed. And I was in the control room with Brian Wilson, and I had assumed that Brian was going to write some notes for him. Those notes weren't there. So we went to the chorus, and I said to Brian, have him play eighth note triplets, secco, dry as a bone, the fundamental of the chord, eighth note, da 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 da, and as a result, got the Ruby Slippers moment of the song. I did that by my power of observation. I was there, lucky enough to be in the room with this gent, and I said, Arco. Brian went on talkback. He said, Jesse, Van Dyke says Barco. Jesse looked at Brian through the control room window and he said, Barco? I said, tell him with a bow, Brian. So, Arco, it was.
Van Dyke declined Brian's proposal to complete unfinished lyrics for Good Vibrations, preferring a joint creative effort. Writing together at Brian's home, their collaboration terms included Wilson purchasing Parks a $5,000 Volvo to address his transportation needs. When it came time for writing material for SMiLE, Van Dyke would go up to Brian's house, Brian would be at the piano, and Van Dyke would sit beside him. Van Dyke said, when I was working with Brian, I was available to him 24 hours a day. Every time I went up to his house we worked, we always got something done. When we got together, it was, Your Honour, may I approach the bench? And he would say yes, and I would go over there and approach the bench, and I would sit next to him on the bench. And he loved that. Just great fraternity. It was wonderful. It was just great. A fair-minded guy, no nonsense. Top of the heap saying, come on in. At one point for a certain time, Van Dyke and his then-wife Dory Parks moved in with Brian and his wife Marilyn. Some of Brian's eccentric behaviour Van Dyke was not down with, like when Brian moved his piano into the sandbox. Van Dyke didn't like that the dog started shitting in the sandbox, which I think is hilarious, man. I think that's such a cool idea, to put a piano in a sandbox and you put your feet in it, and it is like being on the sand. It's cool, man. That's cool.
I said I want to feel like I was on the beach, riding on the beach. So we had a guy install about 10 feet by 10 feet sandbox.
Thank God I got there before the dogs did.
I was asked to go into the sandbox to work. I worked outside the sandbox. I just couldn't bring myself to sit on the sand with the dogs.
We sat barefooted, just like it gave us the feeling that we were on the beach.
Shut your eyes and you're feeling the sand. Then it made sense.
What really became the problems was the two dogs crapping in the sand.
And so what did you write in the sandbox?
We wrote Heroes and Villains, Cabin Essence, Surf's Up, and Wonderful in the sandbox.
It was a pretty good sandbox.
Yeah, it was a great sandbox, yeah.
For this video, we will follow the SMiLE sessions order for the record. Of course, not saying that that would have been the order for the record. It's kind of based on Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE. So we'll go with the SMiLE sessions. SMiLE opens with the beautiful Our Prayer, which showcases the Beach Boys' amazing harmonies. But it's not just the harmonies, it's the vibe. And Brian was able to create a vibe within his music, because it's not just the notes you play, It's equally as important the vibe you create and the atmosphere you create. And Our Prayer created that atmosphere for the first track of SMiLE. Our Prayer then segues into the non-Brian Wilson composition G before it reaches the first track that Dyke Parks and Brian wrote together, Heroes and Villains. Heroes and Villains invokes the images and atmosphere of the Wild West. Brian had a talent at being able to instill such a vibe in his work. He was able to paint with his music and give you such a beautiful image of what he was trying to describe.
I would listen to the radio and I'd hear the lyrics. I think I want to create lyrics for Van Dyke that's a notch up, about a notch up from the other lyrics that I was hearing. A little more artistic and poetic.
What I remember is the first thing we did was Heroes and Villains.
Oh my God.
Whole bunch of notes.
In the key of C sharp.
That scared the hell out of me. I mean, just in terms of words, as I recall it, we got lucky, we got some wind at our back, we sat there one day, and we knocked it to the ground.
Brian told Van Dyke that he had thought of the Old West when conceiving the melody. With regards to the lyrics, Van Dyke was reminded of the Marty Robbins 1959 song El Paso, and immediately conceived the opening line, "I've been in this town so long that back in the city, I've been taken for lost and gone and unknown for a long, long time." There are conflicting reports regarding who came up with the title. Brian credits Van Dyke with naming the song, but Van Dyke denied this, saying that he wrote the lyrics around the title that Brian has suggested. Brian's then wife Marilyn said, "There are so many screwed up people in the music industry, the good guys and the bad guys. That's one thing Brian had in his mind when he did Heroes and Villains." Van Dyke said the lyrics were based on the early history of California, including references to the involvement of the Spanish and American Indians. In Van Dyke's recollection, all but one section of Heroes and Villains was written entirely in one writing session. Heroes and Villains is one of the most complex productions in the Beach Boys' career. There was so much music and different sections recorded for the song that it said that production costs for Heroes and Villains alone was $40,000. Brian was constantly adding more sections and putting together various mixes. On the 11th of May 1966, Brian went into Gold Star Studios and recorded an instrumental take of Heroes and Villains with a runtime of 2 minutes 45 seconds. According to music historian Keith Badman, the session was conducted as an experiment and was not a fully fledged recording. It was one of the many recordings of the songs that has since perished or presumed lost or missing. For Heroes and Villains, Brian, like he did on Good Vibrations and many other tracks, recorded in various studios such as Western, Gold Star, Columbia. He again used the Wrecking Crew as his session musicians like he'd done on the previous few Beach Boys albums. I think also Heroes and Villains shows where Brian was starting to get stuck in the SMiLE puzzle because he kept recording and kept recording. Like if you think about it, he started recording Heroes and Villains on May 11, 1966, and still in 1967 he was adding more parts to it. So he just got stuck in that maze that he seemed to not be able to finish it. He just kept adding more fragments and more bits and pieces. And like I'll talk at the end of the video, that's one of the reasons why I think SMiLE didn't get finished. Van Dyke would continue the lyrical theme of Indians in Do You Like Worms, or also referred to as Roll Plymouth Rock. Again with SMiLE, there's conflicting information of was it going to be called Do You Like Worms or not. Al Jardine said, "I kept yelling at people over a capital. There's not one goddamn lyric about worms on this track. It's called Roll Plymouth Rock. I defy you to find anything about worms on there, but they wanted to name it Do You Like Worms. I'm sure that there was a song that Brian and Van Dyke did do called Do You Like Worms that they didn't even play for us." But studio dialogue from the October 18th session 1966 contradicts what Al says, because you can clearly hear Brian saying, "Do you like worms?"
Do you like worms? But what's that? Boop, boop.
But for the sake of this video, we can say, "Do you like worms?" or "Roll Plymouth Rock." According to Van Dyke, it's about bringing this Euro sensibility into the taming of the American continent from Plymouth Rock to Waikiki. The bicycle rider mentioned in the lyric is a reference to the bicycle rider playing cards printed by the United States Playing Card Company during the 19th century. Van Dyke said, "A lot of people misinterpreted that, but that's okay. It's okay not to be told what to think if you're the audience." Most of the instrumental backing for the track took place on October 18th, 1966 at Western Studios. There's a callback to Heroes and Villains via the Bicycle Rider section. I'm in Great Shape, which, like a later song on SMiLE, Vegetables, would allude to Brian's interests at the time with healthy living and eating. The core instrumental track for I'm in Great Shape was recorded on October 27th, 1966 at Western. On November 4th, Brian recorded a piano demonstration of Heroes and Villains that included I'm in Great Shape and Barnyard as sections of the song. Van Dyke and KHJ DJ Humble Harv Miller are also featured on this recording, the former providing animal sounds for Barnyard. But it does work well coming before the woodshop section. As a part of I'm in Great Shape, with the woodshop section tucked on to the end of a 2018 release of Child is the Father of the Man, but they just put it in as kind of a little Easter egg. 2 years after the SMiLE sessions had been released, in 2013, an acetate of an early mix of Heroes and Villains was discovered. It indicated that Brian had experimented with incorporating recorded sections of I'm in Great Shape into the projected Heroes and Villains single. In reference to I'm in Great Shape, Dyke Parks said, "It's interesting how in the lyrics there was all of a sudden this turning to eggs and grits. It's because it had something to do with the thought of a barnyard, and that related to the place we were trying to come up with in Heroes and Villains. All those lyrics were visual efforts." The effect at the end is achieved using tape feedback, which most people don't have analog tape recorders, but you can use a plugin to try and get that effect, and here is how I did it. There's a lot of humour in SMiLE, and Barnyard is one of those tracks that displays Brian's humour. It features Brian's friends and different band members making animal noises.
He'd assign different animals. And of course the first fight would be, I want to be the wolf, I want to be, and then we would make animal noises.
In 1978, Brian spoke of a Barnyard suite, which, as he said, would have been 4 songs in 4 short pieces combined together, but we never finished that one. We got into something else. Barnyard was tracked on October 20th, 1966 at Western. Again, it's hard to know, was this originally going to be part of the Heroes and Villains suite, or would the song have been fleshed out? We can never know. But I think it's a cool little song. I like it. I dig it. On the 14th of November, Brian recorded My Only Sunshine, a medley of the standards The Old Master Painter and You Are My Sunshine. The renditions are relatively short because Brian said he couldn't remember the full song. During the recording, Brian remarked that the session players should play as though they are far away, as the lyrics suggest, reflective of the spiritual themes recurring throughout the SMiLE songs. The Old Master Painter is a song that evokes God in its lyrics. The master take for You Are My Sunshine was spliced out of the original reel so that Dennis Wilson could add a lead vocal. In 1968, a mono mixdown of the tape was created, but as of 2004, the original master had gone missing from the band's archives. Sessions for My Only Sunshine took place on the 14th of November 1966 and the 10th of February 1967.
This is Studio 3 at Western. This is where I recorded a lot of music. My drummer, Hal Blaine, was right over there on the left. Jamie Glory on baritone sax, Steve Douglas on tenor, and Jim Horn on tenor were right there. Carol Kay on electric bass here, Ray Poe on electric bass here, and Lyle Ritz on stand-up bass there. The keyboards, Don Randy and Larry Nectar were here, right there. And Julius Wechter was the percussionist. He played right there.
And where would the strings be?
The strings would be right over here. 4 violins, 4 violas, and 4 cellos would be right here. Here's where the engineer was. Chuck Brooks was here. I was here producing, and our friends, the visitors, would be down there in chairs. And we'd get it on.
The last song in the first movement of SMiLE is another centerpiece, Cabin Essence. Brian was such a master at painting beautiful pictures with his music. He had a great knack for choosing the right instruments to evoke the images that he wanted to represent within his music. It is also one of the many songs lyrically where Van Dyke Parks' lyrics came into question by Mike Love. During the initial recording for the song in late 1966, Van Dyke was called into the studio to settle a dispute from Mike Love over the lyrics.
I told Van Dyke Parks, I asked him actually, what does this passage of lyrics mean?
I said, quite frankly, I don't know.
He says, I haven't a clue. So to me, I'm thinking, well, logically, we have an audience. We have a song. We were trying to portray something. Don't you want to relate to that audience?
Hey, they don't mean a damn thing, but they create an image that I find appealing.
Although Van Dyke refused to say what the lyrics were about, Mike sang the lines despite his reservations. Van Dyke said that himself and Brian were attempting to write a song that would end on a freeze frame of the Union Pacific Railroad. He also said, the whole thing seems to be about taking of the territory. Folks sing a song of the Grange. Granges were collectives of farms that would pool their resources so they could set their own prices, so that they weren't competing so much with each other, but so they were finding a reasonable return for their endeavours. Of course, that's almost a thing of the past, with the family farm disappearing from the country now, and agribusinesses the way it is. But the Grange system was the backbone of the American farm, and we had to bring the Chinese into this equation because they were working on the railroad, and the prairie was absolutely dependent on the railroads. Instrumentally, the track uses more Americana-type instruments such as banjo, harmonica and dobro. Vocally, there is some wonderful vocal arrangements by Brian, almost chant-like in some places. The song starts off in a rather chilled kind of manner until it erupts when the Who Ran the Iron Horse section comes in, and it really gives the sound of movement and expansion, but all the instruments around it, like the cello and the bass, the fuzz bass is amazing, add this movement to the song, which is said to evoke the sound of the workers assembling the train tracks. But it does have this really expansive sound. It's almost like you're kind of flying over something, if you get me. Cabin Essence, like many songs on SMiLE, is recorded in a modular fashion that Brian had started with on Good Vibrations. The instrumental tracking for the Home on the Range section was recorded on October 3rd, 1966 at Gold Star Studios. A vocal and instrumental section for the Home on the Range section was taped on October 11th at Western Studio. Carl also overdubbed guitar on this session. The next day, on October 12th, Brian produced the Grand Coulee Dam section at Columbia Studio. Brian said, "The night I cut the instrumental part of Cabin Essence, no one could believe that a waltz could rock that hard. I had the 6-string bass player play electric fuzz tones. This got it going good. I was sure that I had recorded the most rockin' waltz ever recorded." On October 6th, further vocal overdubs were tracked at Columbia for Cabin Essence, a session that included the recording of Mike Love singing the Grand Coulee section. Structurally, it's quite simple. It's basically verse, chorus, verse, and then outro. But within the simple structure, Brian did some interesting things, like there's a nice modulation from E flat major in the verse to F major in the chorus. And I always love the way Brian modulates, because it doesn't seem like he's going, right, I need to change key here. It seems all very natural. And vocally, the Beach Boys are doing some really wild stuff, which is great. Lyrically, you can kind of get what Van Dyke Parks is saying at some points, and then sometimes it's very metaphorical. But for me, I like that, you know. I think Cabin Essence is almost like the old world meeting the new world, you know, the frontier and all that kind of things. And it's a really interesting track.
It was simple, straightforward, uncomplicated, collaborative heaven. It's heaven on earth.
The second movement of SMiLE begins with the lovely harpsichord-driven Wonderful. Brian had talked about SMiLE in terms of a teenage symphony to God, and Wonderful references religion and God in lyrics such as never known as a non-believer. An interesting side note about the lyrics is that Van Dyke Parks was never credited as a co-writer of the track until he broached the issue with Brian in 2003. He was then awarded a co-write as a lyricist. There were 3 versions of Wonderful recorded. One labelled Rock With Me Henry, which had drums, which was interesting but far inferior to the version of Wonderful we know and love. The third version was a piano version. The basic track for the first version was recorded on August 25th, 1966 at Western. It took 18 takes to record. Wilson had trouble playing the harpsichord. At one point in the session he remarked to engineer Chuck Britz, "Some of these notes are fucking up. I swear to God you push them and they don't go." On October 6th, Brian overdubbed a lead vocal onto the track. Drums and other instruments were also added to the track during the session. Wilson then created a rough mix for the track. Further vocals were recorded for the song on December 15th at Columbia Studio. Wonderful features the Beach Boys and 3 other players outside of the Beach Boys, which include Larry Kenstill on grand piano, Lyle Ritz on upright bass, overdub tenor ukulele, and Alan Waite on trumpet. Look was one of the earliest pieces recorded during the SMiLE sessions. Musicologist Philip Lambert speculated that some parts of the music possibly evolved from one of the riffs in Good Vibrations. Look, like many of the other tracks on SMiLE, included the Wrecking Crew. It was recorded on August 12th, 1966 at Western Studio. It was titled Look on the tape box, but on the AMF sheet it was logged as Untitled Song Number 1 with a runtime of 2 minutes 16 seconds. Take 20 was marked as the best. Capitol Records documentation suggests that on October 13th, all 6 Beach Boys were involved in a vocal overdubbing session for the track, now logged as I ran, with a runtime of 3 minutes 10 seconds. Writing in the SMiLE Sessions liner notes, Craig Slowinski said that a tape from that session has not turned up in a search of the Capitol and B or I vaults. Child is the father of the man. The title derives from an idiom meaning that the man is the product of habits and behaviours developed in youth. It has one of the most lovely musical passages on SMiLE with the piano, which enters at 25 seconds. I remember the first time I heard that piano section from some bootleg, it gave me goosebumps. It was so simple but so effective.
Wow. Is that just before Surf's Up?
It sort of has that vibe, doesn't it? It could work.
Reminds me of it. It has that kind of thing going.
The instrumental track for Child is the Father of the Man was recorded on October 7th and October 11th, 1966 at Western Studios. Vocals were overdubbed by the group on October 12th and December 2nd at Columbia Studios. Mark Lynette, who mixed the SMiLE Sessions box set, said there are vocal parts obscured by Carl Wilson singing on the track. When he's not singing, you can hear faint background vocal parts that no longer exist on the multitrack. They must have been in his headphones and were picked up by the vocal mic. It could be that Brian decided he didn't need them, or that he was going to re-record them, but never did. You hear this sort of stuff throughout the tapes. On the underrated Friends album of 1968, the Beach Boys repurposed some of Child is the Father of the Man. This can be heard at 1 minute 25 seconds on the track Little Bird. The final song of the second movement is another centrepiece of SMiLE, Surf's Up. In my opinion, it's one of the greatest songs that Brian ever wrote. Van Dyke's lyrics, along with Brian's music, paint such a mood and vibe. The first time I heard the track, it totally floored me. Again, it's one of those goosebumps kind of moments when you first hear it. Surf's Up was the second song Brian and Van Dyke wrote together. It was composed as a 2-movement piece, most of it in one night, and it said they were high on Brian's desbutalls. Michael Vossi, who was Brian's former personal assistant, wrote in a self-penned article in 1969 that Surf's Up was to be the closing track and that the song would have been followed by a choral amen sort of thing. It could have worked as a closer for the album, but again it's hard to tell without hearing it sequenced properly. Surf's Up, like many other Brian Wilson compositions, shows Brian's talent for chord progressions, inversions and modulations. Lyrically, Surf's Up is opaque and poetic. And you can look at it two ways, as surf's up, as in when you say surf's up, it means you're going surfing. But you can also look at in surf's up that it's surf's up, it's over, like surf's up, time is up, But maybe Van Dyke's saying it was a new beginning and not an end. The last 3 lines of lyric relate back to the previous songs in the second movement. I heard the word, wonderful thing, a children's song. In Jules Siegel's October 1967 memoir for Cheetah magazine titled Goodbye Surfing, Hello God, he quoted Brian's explanation of the album's lyrics, reportedly saying, Surf's Up is about a man at a concert that is overtaken by music. Collimated Room's domino symbolises the collapse of empires, ideas, lives and institutions. After the lyric, canvas the town and brush the backdrop, the song's protagonist sets off on his vision on a trip. He then suffers a choke of grief at his own suffering and the emptiness of life. At the end, he then finds hope to the tides, to the beach, to childhood, before experiencing the joy of enlightenment of seeing God, which manifests in a children's song. Wilson concluded his summary. Of course, that's the very intellectual explanation, but maybe sometimes you have to do an intellectual thing. Music historian Clinton Halen suggests that Brian had merely repeated an explanation that was originally given by Dyke Parks. With regard to the information for Surf's Up, I shall only concentrate on the 1960s sessions and not include the 1971 sessions that took place for the Surf's Up album. The first tracking session for Surf's Up was at Western on November 4th, 1966. It was logged with the subtitle, First Movement. The November 7th session was dedicated to experimenting with horn effects, including an exercise in which Brian instructed his musicians to laugh and have conversations through their instruments. The tape of this experiment was later given the label George Fell Into His French Horn.
You need to lay there and tell me that George fell into his French horn.
There are at least 2 known Surf's Up recordings that have been presumed missing or lost. A vocal session at Columbia Studio from December 15th, 1966, and 2 sessions at Western from January 23rd, 1967. According to author Keith Badman, the December 15th session included vocal and piano overdubs onto the first movement backing track, as well as further recording on Wonderful. Jules Siegel later claimed that the session went very badly. Later that evening, Brian had been filmed at Columbia Studios singing and performing Surf's Up on the piano for use in David Oppenheim's CBS-commissioned documentary Inside Pop, The Rock Revolution, which was hosted by Leonard Bernstein. Siegel said, I was there when we did Surf's Up for the CBS cameras. I was in the car with him. We smoked a joint before he went and did that, and afterwards I said to him, why don't you just stop fucking around with this stuff and just release that as a single like now? Don't wait for the album to do it. But he said he was afraid to do it. Brian and Oppenheim were dissatisfied with what they had filmed and decided to reshoot the sequence at Brian's home 2 days later on December 17th. His performance that day, executed in one take with the candelabra placed on his grand piano, was captured by 3 film cameras and deemed satisfactory for use in the documentary.
And we would be wise not to behave like ostriches about it. Besides, as I said, I like it. Of course, what I like is maybe 5% of the whole output, which pours over this country like the 2 oceans from both coasts, and it's mostly trash. But that good 5% is so exciting and vital, and may I say significant, that it claims the attention of every thinking person.
Here is a new song, too complex to get all of first time around. It could come only out of the ferment that characterizes today's pop music scene. Brian Wilson, leader of the famous Beach Boys and one of today's most important pop musicians, sings his own Surf's Up.
Dove-nested towers, the hour was struck, the straight quicksilver.
I remember when I saw a snippet of that performance on a Brian Wilson documentary that the Biography Channel did, and I was just like, oh my god, wow. It was just amazing. Having someone like Leonard Bernstein endorse what Brian was doing with Surf's Up was a big validation for Van Dyke and Brian. Van Dyke said,
So that gave us some kind of validation that we were doing the right thing to explore, to try to get outside the box.
What does all this mean? I think it's all part of a historic revolution,
Pollinated ruins die.
The lost sessions from January 1967 reportedly involved additional instrumental tracking, including a 16-piece string and horn section that was overdubbed onto a bounce tape of the backing track from December 15th. When asked what he had remembered of the song's second movement in 2003, Brian responded that it was supposed to feature a string ensemble. Interestingly, after SMiLE had been abandoned, in late 1967, Brian recorded several takes of another piano vocal performance of Surf's Up at his home studio, presumably recorded during the Wild Honey sessions. I've talked about tracks being centerpieces for the album, but I think Surf's Up is probably the one that stands out the most. I think it's the true centerpiece of the record.
At that point, things were going along in such a strong direction that it never occurred to me that anything would stop SMiLE on any level whatsoever.
The third movement of SMiLE, which is sometimes known as the Elemental Suite, starts with the Johnny Mercer penned track I Wanna Be Around before blending into Workshop, which is basically Brian using a technique called Foley or Foley recording, where you kind of record different sounds, where like different everyday sounds essentially. It was done more in kind of avant-garde music, and it would have been done in things like film and stuff like that, to get sounds. But Brian was incorporating that into SMiLE by using things from a workshop to give that kind of vibe and atmosphere. And I think it just works really well. As a track, it's not a track. It's just kind of a nice little thing, which is cool. Vegetables or Vegetables was born out of a time where Brian had an interest in healthy living. In a 1967 article, Brian said, I want to turn people onto vegetables. Good natural food, organic food. Health is an important element in spiritual enlightenment, but I do not want to be pompous about it, so we will engage in a satirical approach. A few years later, in 1969, Brian would open a health food store called the Radiant Radish in West Hollywood.
Well, he decided one night that he wanted for all of us to be healthy. So he somehow got rid of all the furniture that was in the living room, and they were all, I walked in and the whole living room was just blue mats, blue tumbling mats.
I wanted other people to exercise, but I really didn't want to do it. I was too lazy to do it.
Well, he would be the team leader and get everybody doing exercises in the pool. Come on, this is good for you. And then after a while, you start going, I don't know. It's cold out, man. I don't.
Yeah, there's a contradiction there that I didn't want to do it myself, but I wanted other people to do it.
Brian would then take the song and we'd have to act it out. If it was Vegetables, I became, I think, David Carrot or Dave Carrot, whatever I was. And Mike Vossi was the celery.
I thought Brian was doing all of it with a great sense of humor. And let's keep in mind that this was a time when people were first starting to think about eating healthfully. A lot of what he's saying made a lot of sense.
Within SMiLE, there's like loads of lore. And I think that's what's kind of interesting about it, because it's lore. But there's that Paul McCartney lore, which is true that Paul McCartney did visit the Beach Boys session in 1967. But it's unknown if he actually appears on the finished version of Vegetables. But McCartney said, I just went round to the studio because they invited me. I just thought it would be fun to sit there and watch them record, because I'm a big fan. And so I was there, and then it was, I think, Brian who came over and said, oh, Paul, got a favour to ask. Would you mind recording something? I thought, oh no, but great. I could do that. Oh God, I'm going to be singing on a Beach Boys record or something, I got a bit kind of intimidated and thought, okay, there goes nothing. And they said, well, what we want you to do is go in there and just munch. Well, I can do that. So if you hear somebody munching celery, that's me. Sessions for the track were said to have taken place between October 17th, 1966 and ended on June 15th, 1967. As with many Beach Boys tracks, Vegetables was recorded in various studios such as Columbia, Western, Sound Recordings and Gold Star, and they also recorded some vocals at Brian's place in Bel Air. The Beach Boys recorded a rudimentary version of Vegetables, a demo with different lyrics and a different vocal arrangement on October 17, 1966. Band archivist Craig Slowinski suggests that the session may have taken place on this day, however the exact date is unknown. This demo contained the unused cornucopia verse. In February 1967, Brian announced that Vegetables would be the lead single from SMiLE, which in doing so exacerbated tensions between himself and Dyke Parks, who felt that the song was one of the weaker efforts on SMiLE. According to David Anderley, creative differences between Dyke and Brian had escalated since February. Dyke was against having the song as the album's lead single, saying, "I didn't want Vegetables to be given too much emphasis. For SMiLE that celebrated collaboration, to be dependent on a commercial release of Vegetables as a single was tremendously ill-advised wherever it came from." On November 4th, 1966, Brian produced a session dedicated to capturing a humorous situation featuring himself, Dyke Parks, Danny Hutchins, Michael Vossi, and a man named Bob. Towards the end of that recording, the group plays a rhythm on bongos while chanting, "Where's my beets and carrots, and I've got a big bag of vegetables." Brian produced another humorous section on November 16th, this time dedicated to recording mock disagreements between Vossi and session drummer Hal Blaine. The first major session dedicated to tracking any part of Vegetables took place on January 3rd, 1967. However, at this time, part of the song had been configured as a section of Heroes and Villains and logged with the title Do a Lot. Material recorded that day did not become part of the finished song. Dyke Parks and Brian Wilson temporarily dissolved their partnership on the 2nd of March after a session of Heroes and Villains. A recording session for vocals on Vegetables was held the next day, but further session dates scheduled on March 28th and March 30th were cancelled. Dyke returned to the project after March 31st. The band spent at least 8 studio dates recording Vegetables before embarking on a US tour on April 14th. Dyke's last recorded appearance on the album sessions was for a Vegetables date on April 14th, after which he withdrew from the project. Wilson then took a 4-week break from the studio. On April 29th, band publicist Derek Taylor reported that the single, Backed It Wonderful, would soon be released. He described it as a light and lyrical day-to-day greengrocery song on which Al Jardine sings a most vigorous lead. Holidays was recorded on September 8th, 1966 at Western. It's a really sweet little tune and contains marimbas and woodwinds. It's unknown would there have been lyrics to it, but I'm not sure there would have been because it was recorded quite early in the process of SMiLE. So, who knows, it could have been just one of these little fragments and vignettes that Brian had wrote. But it does incorporate some of the same instruments like marimba on the next track, Windchimes. Windchimes begins with a really mellow vibe, sung beautifully as usual by Carl Wilson, before erupting into this bombastic sound with sax, drums and more. Lyrically, Dyke's words complement Brian's pictorial music, and Dyke does add a nice pun, "In the late afternoon you're hung up on wind chimes." Brian's wife at the time, Marlon, said, "We went shopping one day and we bought home some wind chimes. We hung them outside the house, and then one day while Brian was sitting around, he sort of watched them out of the window and then he wrote the song. I think that's how it happened. Simple. He does a lot of things that way." Windchimes, in its original form, was first tracked on August 3rd, 1966 at Gold Star Studios. Another version of the song was tracked on October 3rd, 1966, which was later followed by further overdubs on October 5th and 10th at Western Studios. The track is in the key of C, and surprisingly for a Brian Wilson composition, there are no key changes, but there are some nice slash chords. Dyke Parks said, "When we got to Windchimes on the mallet tremolos, I remember at that point Brian asked me to play mallets, but the fellow who really played them was Gary Coleman, the great percussionist, who came down to do a lot of percussion for the album. We discovered that by recording at half speed, you could come down an octave, so you could play anything at half speed, an octave lower, raise the speed to normal speed, and then you'd sound like you could play like a son of a bitch, like an expert. It gave you velocity that you didn't really have." And now we come to the darkest track on SMiLE, which might give us insight into Brian's psyche at the time, Fire. Fire might be the most avant-garde track Brian ever wrote. There's a slight uneasy sound to it with the strings. It starts off in this sinister, jovial way before going into this heavy avant-garde sound starting at 41 seconds. It really does feel like a song spiraling out of control, which I think mirrors Brian's increasingly troubled mental health state at the time. And yet it really does evoke the sound of fire by what the strings are playing. Again, Brian was excellent at painting pictures with his music. Even though the track was recorded early-ish in the SMiLE project, it does show, in hindsight, Brian starting to get into a darker headspace. Fire was produced on November 28, 1966 at Gold Star Studios, with 15 session musicians, including 3 bassists, 4 flutists, and a string sextet. To help set the mood, Brian instructed everyone in the studios to don a fire helmet and had a bucket of burning wood placed in the recording space so that the area would smell of smoke. Within a few days of the session, Brian was frightened to learn that a nearby building had burnt down shortly after the recording was made. He believed that the recording somehow contributed to the fire and decided to shelve the recording. All these things added to Brian's fragile mental state at the time.
Recording fire was like we brought fire helmets for the musicians, little toy fire hats, and I brought in a bucket of fire, and it made the mood come real good. It would go real good.
All of a sudden, the wheel in the trash barrel on fire was not conducive to breathing. Don't worry, it won't be on the record. You know, they won't hear it. Oh, that's great.
Now, remember, there would have been 5, 6, 7 of these going on at once. Everybody had a whistle.
I was feeling unhappy, so I thought that fire tape would express the crazy, weird thoughts I was going through.
Down the street from the studio, there was a warehouse that burned down to the ground. It burned to the ground. And I thought it was my fault when we did the fire tapes that day. I thought that the fire tapes, the songs that the music that we created about fire, I thought that was responsible for the building burning down to the ground.
There was like, all of this was so much fun. And I was watching the guy in crisis. And I knew that all of a sudden, if this was a joke, it was at someone's expense. And whose expense was it but Brian's?
Van Dyke Parks recalled that an elemental concept did not come up until later in the project. Van Dyke Parks said about fire, "I avoided the fire sessions like the plague. I didn't want to embarrass myself, and I thought it was regressive behaviour." The instrumental was recorded in 18 takes, after which Brian recorded the crackling noises made by the burning wood and mixed them into the track. Jules Siegel is quoted saying that Brian said, "Yeah, I'm going to call this Mrs. O'Leary's Fire, and I might just scare a whole lot of people." Fire is the least melodic track on SMiLE, but I think it's a really cool track. It's interesting. It's so it's very unique in its sound, and definitely unique in 1967. The fire is then put out by the water of Love to Say Dada. The song did morph into Cool Cool Water some years later, so maybe I'm stretching saying it's water, but hey, I think it works. It was the last song Brian worked on for SMiLE. The interesting thing is that in early May, Derek Taylor announced that SMiLE was abandoned, yet Brian recorded this after the announcement. From the 16th of May till the 18th of May 1967, Brian produced 3 sessions dedicated to the track at Gold Star Studios. Another session scheduled for May 19 would have likely seen further work on the track that was cancelled. According to music historian Keith Badman, these occasions marked the final sessions for the SMiLE album. The final track is one that is contentious, as people are unsure if it was ever going to be on the album. I would imagine Capitol would have forced Brian to put it on the record, as I said earlier, as a way to sell records. The track, of course, is the progressive pop masterpiece, Good Vibrations. I've actually made a full video on this track, so I'm not going to go too much into it. But personally, I think it fits SMiLE. Creating music is very similar to painting because you're using different colours. You know, different instruments have different colours and different sounds have different colours. So you're kind of just painting, really. And yeah, I like the way Brian painted, let's put it that way. But I think one of the important instruments of Good Vibrations is the theremin, or more specifically, the electrotheremin. The electrotheremin, or the tannerin, played on Good Vibrations, was created by Paul Tanner, and Bob Whitzel. As well as being one of the inventors of the electro-theremin, Paul Tanner also played it on Good Vibrations, and he had previously played it on I Just Wasn't Made for These Times. The electro-themin differs than the traditional theremin. It's actually easier to play an electro-theremin. The instrument features a tone and portamento similar to that of a theremin, but with a different control mechanism. It consists of a sine wave generator with a knob controlling the pitch, placed inside a wooden box. The pitch knob is attached to a slider on the outside of the box with some string. The first session for Good Vibrations took place on the 17th of February 1966 at Gold Star Studios. It was logged as a pet sound session. Good Vibrations was reported to have used over 90 hours of tape. One estimate of the overall production costs are between $50,000 and $75,000. It took 17 sessions to complete the track and was recorded in 4 different studios, which are Western, Columbia, Gold Star and Hollywood. Though on the box set, the SMiLE box set, it says that some of it was recorded at Sunset Sound. Now we've come to that part of why SMiLE was never finished. I think you're never going to get a definitive answer of why SMiLE was never finished, because I think it was many things. I mean, Brian said in 2004,
I'll tell you from my heart. In 1967, the reasons why I didn't finish SMiLE was Mike didn't like it. I thought it was too experimental. I thought that the fire tape was too scary. I thought that people wouldn't understand where my head was at that time. Those were the reasons.
I think it's not one thing. I think it's many things, like the reluctance from Mike and the pressure that was on Brian and Brian's mental health problems. And his drug use. I know some people have said, the drug use wasn't a problem. It's like, if you're taking copious amounts of drugs every day, they're going to affect your day-to-day life. That's just a reality. I also think the release of Heroes and Villains and subsequent failure of it, even though it did get to number 12 in the US charts, it was coming off the back of this massive hit in Good Vibrations. So anything less than number 1 at that point was deemed a failure. And it was like a truncated version of Heroes and Villains too. It wasn't like the version I think Brian had in mind that he wanted to release. So all these things, I think, just mounted on Brian. And you have to look at Brian's mental health at the time. He went to a movie called Seconds, and when he walked in, it said, "Hello, Mr. Wilson." And he thought the movie was about him. He thought it was his life playing out inside that movie. And, he thought his house was bugged by Phil Spector. He thought the fire session that started the fire, the buildings. And his dad, Murray, did have private investigators going around following Brian. So I think all these things, they would take a toll on anyone. And he probably just couldn't deal with it.
He just went somewhere else. He checked out. Or it checked out. I don't know if he made a conscious decision for him to get sick the way he did. He just got sick.
He kind of had no one there to kind of back him up, because Dyke Parks had left at that time. And at the time, Brian had a lot of people around him that were using him, and they were just yes men. He, of course, had people who were looking out for him, were genuine people, but he also had a lot of people who were just leeching off him. So as I said previously, I think the reason SMiLE was never finished was many things. One thing for sure is, I think Brian got caught up in the maze of SMiLE, in that he wasn't able to finish things like he used to be able to do. Like, take Heroes and Villains, he just kept doing parts and kept doing parts for it. And when you add all these things together, like some of the members of the Beach Boys not liking SMiLE, Brian's mental health issues at the time, his drug use, the lawsuit the Beach Boys were going through with Capitol, probably it was just too much, I think. I think it was just too much for the guy at the time. And SMiLE is one of those what-if records, because music at the time had such a cultural influence that you don't know how SMiLE would have influenced things. Like, people think, when you look at music now, like, it has an influence, but the influence of music back in the 60s was way more than it is now. Like, it just is. In popular music, it was way more. But what we have of SMiLE is beautiful and such interesting music that we should be thankful for that. Normally in these videos, I do a recreation of a track, but I thought I'd do something interesting for this one, where I would take different sounds from different tracks and recreate little parts of them. Brian would stack instruments on each other, so he would stack multiple pianos and stuff like that, and Windchimes has kind of multiple sounds stacked on it. To me, it sounds like it's got pianos, harpsichords, and electric harpsichords stacked onto each other, so it kind of creates this sound. So for that, I have an acoustic piano, but I know people at home don't. So I use a virtual instrument, which I used Keyscape, which I don't think is a great sounding piano library. There's no real piano library that sounds like a piano. Like, they sound fine, but they just don't get that depth. But anyways, for this is just to show people how to get sounds, and if they have a piano home, they could do it. You know what I mean? In the sessions of Surf's Up, you can hear Brian say, "Now it sounds like jewellery." And this was Brian talking about the percussive element in Surf's Up. It's keys played. Some people say it's actually jewellery, but it's actually keys going back and forth on your hands. So, you know, I got a set of keys and I did that. And then I doubled it with the shaker as well to put it underneath, and then, you know, has the keys and stuff like that. So, yeah. You're My Sunshine has this eerie sound of the vocals, so I thought I'd try and achieve the sound.
You were my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray. You were my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray.
The 60s was a really innovative time for music technology, because with the advent of tape and manipulating tape, you could get some really interesting effects like slowing the tape down and speeding it up. And also you could use tape feedback to get this really cool sound with things. So here's that tape feedback effect that Brian used on songs such as I'm a Great Shape. At some point, I'd like to do a video recreating a lot of the Beach Boys sounds, because Brian used a lot of different sounds like muted pianos and tack pianos, and even for I Believe in You, Tony Asher and Brian plucked the piano, I think with a hairpin or something like that. So I could try and do that with my piano. But yeah, so thanks for watching the video. Take it easy. Goodbye.